This is part 3 of the Serial Victims episodes. In parts 1 and 2, we told you about the murders of Diane McAnally, Karen McGregor, Leona McGovern, Marjorie Roberts, Jacqueline Gallagher, Tracy Wilde, Margot Lafferty, their subsequent murder investigations and the trials that took place, with part 2 ending with 19-year-old Brian Donnelly being found guilty in November 1998 of murdering 27-year-old Margot Lafferty, the only person up to that point to have been convicted of murdering any of the Glasgow sex workers. However, shortly afterwards, Brian Donnelly's solicitors appealed to the Court of Criminal Appeal, stating that Brian Donnelly should be granted a retrial, as the judge at the murder trial had misdirected the jury regarding CCTV footage that had been crucial to the case. And, after deliberation, the Court of Criminal Appeal did rule this to be the case, and a retrial was granted. This, however, would not take place until February 2001, and Brian Donnelly was to remain in prison, where in March 1999, having been in prison for 3 months, he was slashed across his cheek and required 15 stitches, with it being reported in the Daily Record that the other inmates have been out to get him for a while, and this was the first chance they had. During the 2-week trial in February 2001, further details of the attack on Margot were revealed, with an article in the BBC News quoting that the prosecution had said that Brian Donnelly had punched and kicked her, and she fought back, scratching you. You were incensed. You 6 foot 3 inches or 1.92 metres, and her only 5 foot or 1.52 metres tall. You were fueled with anger and got out of control and banged her head off the wall before strangling her and finally dragging her body along the yard. While Brian's defence team again alleged that Margot's murder had in fact been committed by another man, the same man who they had named in the original trial, who had been working in Glasgow at the time and who did have previous convictions for violent sex crimes against women, this man could not be traced to appear at the retrial. And so, after 2 weeks, Brian Donnelly was once again found guilty of murdering 27-year-old Margot Lafferty. Finally, Margot's family could breathe a sigh of relief that Margot had once again received justice. Margot was the first sex worker victim to receive justice, but would she be the last? No, she wouldn't. And later in 2001, a man believed to have been Jacqueline's murderer was arrested and charged. But before we get to that, let's pick up Jacqueline's case in 1997, a year after her murder. Following Jacqueline's mum, Alice, and DCI Joyce making a joint appeal for information in 1997, a year after Jacqueline had been murdered, and no new information being forthcoming, the murder inquiry began to go cold. Jacqueline's murder was briefly back in the spotlight the following year when, in March 1998, a month after Margot had been found murdered, Jacqueline's boyfriend, 37-year-old Gordon, appeared in court, charged with stealing items from an electrical shop, of smashing the shop window by throwing a vacuum cleaner through it, and of using a standard lamp to repeatedly strike the broken glass left in the shop window. Gordon's counsel told the court that Gordon had carried this out as he had been angry that no one had been arrested for killing his girlfriend Jacqueline, that he was suffering badly following Jacqueline's murder, and that he couldn't actually remember what he had done at all. However, when Gordon's previous record was taken into account, the sheriff residing over the case stated that only a custodial sentence would suffice, before handing Gordon a 6-month sentence. Following this, Jacqueline's murder faded from everyone's minds again. That was until 2001, 5 years after Jacqueline's murder, and the same year Margot's murderer was found guilty for a second time at his retrial, when not only did the true nature of Jacqueline's relationship with her then-boyfriend Gordon come out, but someone was arrested for Jacqueline Gallagher's murder, although he wouldn't stand trial until 2004. Giving the police and prosecution ample time to pull together a case, and they would receive help from unexpected sources. 43-year-old George Johnston from Erskine in Renfrewshire, about a 30-minute drive northwest of Glasgow city centre, became the prime suspect in Jacqueline Gallagher's murder, following him being arrested after he was involved in a road traffic accident which resulted in him being responsible for a fatality and his DNA being taken. Due to advances in forensics, semen had been found on Jacqueline's body and underwear, and when George Johnston's DNA was put into the system, it matched with that found on Jacqueline and her underwear. This was a major breakthrough, and George Johnston was quickly brought in for questioning, where it was discovered that not only had George known Jacqueline, having visited Jacqueline in the red light district twice a week for the previous 4 months before her murder, but he admitted having sex with Jacqueline the night before she was found murdered. However, the police believed he had actually been with Jacqueline on the night she was murdered, had been the last person to see her alive, and had been her killer. And so subsequently, George Johnston was arrested and charged with Jacqueline Gallagher's murder. However, despite George Johnston's DNA being found on Jacqueline and him admitting to knowing and visiting Jacqueline regularly and having sex with her, detectives knew they needed more. And so they turned to Jacqueline's fellow sex workers in the hope that the fragile relationship that had been built between police and sex workers since the murder of Margot Lafferty was strong enough that the sex workers would speak to them and tell them what they knew about George Johnston to try and find evidence to prove he was the brutal man who had so savagely attacked and murdered Jacqueline. Up to the murder of Margot and the subsequent changes the police had brought in to try and support and protect the Glasgow sex workers, nobody wanted to talk to the police. However, hot on the heels of Margot's murderer being brought to justice and the sex workers wanting to see Jacqueline receive justice too, they now were more than happy to talk to any police officer or detective who would listen. With one sex worker friend of Margot's even saying that she never thought she'd say this, but she and other sex workers were actually starting to trust the police. And many sex workers believed they knew just who had killed Jacqueline, a client that instilled so much fear in the Glasgow sex workers that they called him merely the Beast. And many sex workers feared this man so much that they refused to do business with him, even if he offered to pay them extra. Although this man would regularly not pay at all and just take what he wanted, leaving some sex workers needing to be hospitalised. Sadly though, there were still some sex workers that would agree to go with this man, desperate on occasions for the money. One of these women was Jacqueline Gallagher. But why would Jacqueline have been so desperate for money that she would have gone with such a dangerous man, a man that many of her fellow sex workers had told her to avoid? Well, one of the reasons, the main reason perhaps, was Jacqueline's long-term and heroin addict boyfriend, Gordon, who would send Jacqueline to the drag night after night in order to get money to pay for her own and his drug habit. However, on the occasions when she just didn't bring back enough money, he would beat her up, avoiding her face, of course. According to an article in the Daily Record, this beating included stamping on her stomach and burning her thighs with cigarette ends. He wanted to make sure that she really was in pain from his beatings, so it encouraged her to do better the next night, which in turn led to Jacqueline taking on the more dangerous clients, despite knowing the risks, so as to be able to appease the equal risk she faced at home, her boyfriend Gordon's wrath, if she didn't come home with enough money for drugs. Upon detectives being told of this very dangerous man, they were keen to try and find out a name, but all the sex workers could tell them was his surname, Johnston. And when these sex workers were shown a picture of George Johnston, many confirmed that yes, that was the man they knew as the Beast. Although there were quite a number of other sex workers who were not quite as sure that George Johnston was indeed the man they knew as the Beast. Nevertheless, the police were sure and believed they had an extremely strong case to put forward at the murder trial, which began at the High Court in Glasgow in May 2004, where George Johnston was accused of striking Jacqueline repeatedly on the head with a hammer and belt, of binding her arms, biting her, and placing a ligature around her neck and tightening it, before wrapping her body in a curtain and dumping her in a lay-by in Dumbartonshire. George Johnston's defence team lodged a special defence of alibi, claiming he was at home at the time of the murder, and of incrimination, lodging the names of 14 other men who could have been responsible for Jacqueline's murder. At the trial, the jury were told that while George Johnston had been a client of Jacqueline's, having sex with her twice a week for the 4 months prior to her death, and that he was with her the night before she was murdered, he was not in fact with her the night she was murdered. It was explained that George had been using sex workers following the breakdown of his marriage in October 1993, and that the last time George had seen Jacqueline was at his flat, where they had sex, on the 23rd of June 1996, before he then dropped her off back at the red light district a full 24 hours before she had been found murdered. When George took to the stand, he said that he and Jacqueline had somewhat of a friendship, and that they would chat in his van after she had finished working, talking about the personal problems she had, going on to state, according to an article in the BBC News on the 27th of May 2004, that she was a nice lassie. If she saw me, she would give me a wave. She would jump in the van. We would have a blether more often than not. He ended by saying that he had had sex hundreds of times with sex workers and that he had never been violent towards Jacqueline or any other sex worker. The defence also explained that the reason George Johnston's DNA had been found on Jacqueline and her underwear was because he had been with her the night before she was murdered, suggesting perhaps that Jacqueline hadn't washed or changed her underwear from the previous evening. However, Jacqueline's then-boyfriend Gordon took to the stand to say that this was incorrect, that Jacqueline changed her underwear twice a day, and that the only way George Johnston's DNA could have been found on Jacqueline's underwear was if he had been with her the night she was murdered. The prosecution also brought up the fact that George Johnston's work van was white, and that a white van had been seen near the lay-by in Dumbartonshire shortly before Jacqueline's body had been found, although this was quickly countered by the defence team, who stated that George didn't actually get his white work van until a year after Jacqueline's murder. Also taking to the stand was one of George Johnston's former neighbours, who said that he had been in her home on the night Jacqueline had disappeared. Sadly, while the Glasgow sex workers had been more than happy to talk to police officers and tell them of how the beast known as Johnston had hurt so many sex workers over the years, they did not appear at the trial as witnesses, not willing to give evidence on the stand. Then it was over to the jury to deliberate and try and decide whether George Johnston was guilty of Jacqueline's murder or completely innocent. Not an easy task. Which way would you have gone? Guilty or innocent? Or would you have gone with the not proven verdict? A verdict unique to a Scottish court of law, meaning there just isn't enough evidence to convict and the accused is acquitted. Well, it took the jury 4 hours to make their decision. When asked what their decision was, the not proven verdict was announced, upon which Jacqueline's mum, Alice, who had been present throughout, hearing and seeing in detail what had been done to her daughter, wept in the public gallery, devastated that her torment would carry on until someone was put behind bars for her daughter's murder. George Johnston, however, didn't walk out of court a free man. He was in fact taken back to jail, where he was serving a 3-year sentence following the road traffic accident that had led to his DNA being taken, where his careless driving had led to a woman's death. Do you think if the sex workers had appeared in court as witnesses to what the man they knew as Johnston had done to them over the years, it would have swayed the jury? Like I said, not every sex worker, when shown a picture of George Johnston, was sure he was the beast that had hurt many sex workers over the years. And so if George Johnston wasn't this man, who could it have been? Well, apparently he wasn't the only man with a Johnston surname that police had interviewed about the murder of Jacqueline Gallagher, with police saying, according to an article in the Daily Record in 2012, that this man was the most evil man they had ever met, and that he was surrounded by an aura of evil. And this 38-year-old man even appeared in court charged with murder 2 years after Jacqueline had been murdered. John Johnston had been on the police's radar for quite some time, with him being questioned in 1979 regarding the disappearance and likely murder of Lucille Campbell. He was the last person to be seen with her before she disappeared, and so it was thought that he had killed her and buried her body on the grounds of the psychiatric hospital where they both were patients at the time. However, her body was never found, and there was never any proof to charge him. In 1990, 6 years before Jacqueline's murder, John Johnston was accused of murdering a 40-year-old man. However, he was subsequently convicted only of assault. And then in 1998, he was in court again, this time charged with the rape and murder of a female, whereby he threw her out of her 6th floor flat. And he was caught on CCTV smirking at her body as he walked past it. And also charged with raping and sodomizing a man an hour after he had thrown the female from her flat. John Johnston was subsequently convicted of raping the female and charged with culpable homicide due to diminished responsibility. He was sentenced to be detained in the state psychiatric hospital without limit of time. Following his sentencing, his wife said that she had warned police officers time and time again just how dangerous and threatening a man he was, with it being revealed that even police officers were intimidated by this man when he was being questioned. According to a Daily Record article, he was heavily into drink, drugs and sex, and had spent most of his life using sex workers. Now, not too long after John Johnston was finally off the streets, George Johnston was back in the news again, with it being revealed that he was in possession of a videotape that showed Jacqueline's murder scene. Apparently, he had every right to have this, as it had been introduced as evidence at his trial, but many felt it was sickening that a man who many still felt had been responsible for Jacqueline's murder would have such a thing. This fact came to light when George Johnston had been working with a BBC documentary team who had been wanting to work with him regarding his not proven verdict. However, this had been cancelled when he had apparently been sending threatening texts to the presenter of the show, and it was at this point she revealed that he had a tape of Jacqueline's murder scene. So what do you think? Which Johnston do you think could have been responsible for murdering Jacqueline? George or John? Following George Johnston receiving the not proven verdict, a statement in an article from the BBC from the Crown Office read, "The Procurator Fiscal will now discuss with Strathclyde Police if there are any further lines of inquiry to be pursued at this stage." However, Strathclyde Police later stated, according to an article in the Daily Mail, that they were not looking for another suspect for the killing of Jacqueline Gallagher, meaning that Jacqueline's case was now being deemed as unresolved, just like Diane's, Leona's, Karen's and Marjorie's. But would it be the last time any of these cases were reviewed? Well, it would mean that for a while, as a year after the devastating outcome of the not proven verdict in the Jacqueline Gallagher murder trial, the body of another sex worker was found murdered, having been dumped in woodland. Emma Jane Caldwell spent much of her childhood growing up in Cardross, about a 41-minute drive northwest of Glasgow, with her mum Margaret, dad Willie, older sister by 11 years Karen, and brother Jamie, where Emma's mum and dad ran a pub. With Jamie and Emma being so close in age, they soon became inseparable, with Emma being the chatty one and Jamie being the quieter one. Growing up, Emma loved horses, with Emma's mum Margaret saying in an article in the Herald newspaper on the 10th of June 1996 that, when Emma was young, if you asked her what she wanted, meaning a can of juice or a packet of crisps, she'd always say a horse. With the article going on to say that Margaret attempted to smile, but instead was overcome by floods of tears. As a teenager, Emma loved music, with the article saying that she loved listening to Candice Staton, Brandy, and Anastasia, as well as Andrea Bocelli if the mood took her. The first tragedy to hit the Caldwell family was in 1998. Emma's older sister Karen had left home, married, and had 2 children. However, the couple's firstborn son sadly died at the age of 1.5 years old, following a bone marrow transplant being unsuccessful, which had been required as both of Karen's sons had been born without an immune system. And sadly, when Emma was 20 years old, her older sister Karen, at the age of 31 years old, died after a long battle with non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. Karen's death hit the whole family hard and left a huge hole in their lives. But Emma's mum Margaret said in the article that Emma just never seemed to smile anymore, that she seemed to lose the fun out of life, and that although her spark was still there, it had dulled significantly, only later being reignited again by the use of heroin. About a year after Karen's death, Emma had taken a job as a stable girl at a riding school in Glasgow, and this is where she met the man who became her boyfriend, a man who, seeing how unhappy Emma was, offered her drugs to escape. Emma wasn't able to hold down the job at the riding school and so moved back home, with her boyfriend visiting her there and continuing to supply her with drugs, unbeknownst to her family, who didn't find this fact out until about 6 months later, when Emma and this boyfriend had split up and he stopped coming to the house and stopped supplying Emma with heroin, which is when Emma began having withdrawal symptoms. Emma's family tried in vain to get Emma help, visiting doctors and hospitals, but apparently they were told that nothing could be done. It got so bad one night that despite Emma's mum and dad vowing never to buy her drugs, Emma's dad Willie relented and gave her money so she could get some drugs to see her through the night. In 2003, 4 years since Emma started taking heroin, she moved out of her parents' home and into a hostel in Glasgow, but her mum and dad visited Emma every week, doing her washing or ironing, topping up her mobile, decorating a room at the hostel, bringing her fresh food, and even buying her a television, which Emma loved and promised she would never sell to fund her habit, which she never did. It's not known exactly when Emma turned to sex work, but her parents believe, looking back at conversations, it was likely about 6 months prior to her being murdered. And with her drug habit being about £100 or $125 a week by this time, she likely would have been left with no choice. Emma Caldwell, who was 5 foot 6 inches or 1.7 meters tall, with a slim build, shoulder-length blonde hair and a heart-shaped tattoo on her back, was reported missing on the 11th of April 2005. But her reported last sighting was on the 4th of April, near a women's hostel in the Govan Hill area of Glasgow, about 11 p.m. However, her body was not found until the 8th of May, when a dog walker came across her badly decomposed body in a remote woodland near Biggar, about a 55-minute drive away from where she reportedly was last sighted in the Govan Hill area. While a murder inquiry was soon underway, Detective Superintendent Willie Johnston, the officer in charge of the inquiry, was quick to state that the investigation into Emma's murder was not going to be an easy one, given that while Emma may have had regular clients, there were just as many strangers that she encountered on her nights working on the drag. And the detective was right, as despite a thorough investigation, a detailed forensic search of the area at the time and again 10 years later, and many appeals by detectives and Emma's family being made, Emma's murder inquiry began to go cold, which did nothing to alleviate the ever-present murmurings that a serial killer was murdering the Glasgow sex workers. Although you might have guessed, because I haven't been able to go into any detail about Emma's murder investigation, that it wouldn't be a cold case forever. And Emma's case wouldn't be the only case that didn't stay cold. But we'll get to that. While following Margot Lafferty's murder, the relationship between the Glasgow sex workers and police officers did improve, with one of Margot's fellow sex workers saying that she felt she could actually trust the police, and many organisations opening in the heart of the red light district to help sex workers and to try and support them to find alternatives to selling themselves on the street. Sadly, by the time of Emma Caldwell's murder, the relationship between the sex workers and the police had well and truly broken down, and sex workers were once again facing increasing levels of danger, with it being reported in a BBC article in 2006, a year and a half after Emma's body had been found, that one sex worker had been attacked so severely and thrown from a client's car that she had lost part of her arm. But it was reported in the Herald newspaper that research had shown that around 90% of women on the streets had experienced violence, with up to 70% of those incidents not being reported to the police. At this point, it was again stated that one way to protect the sex workers was to allow them to work in safer conditions, such as setting certain areas aside for them to be able to work. And until this happened, according to Ruth Morgan Thomas, who was the project manager of a charity in Edinburgh, who said in an article in The Scotsman, the women would continue to be failed by Scotland's justice system because they were not taken seriously by the police. She went on to say that some police officers see the violence as part of the job of a sex worker. No woman should have to accept that. And that when they report violence, the police are dismissive and tell the women they shouldn't be out on the streets. Incredibly, despite the murders of so many Glasgow sex workers, the decision was made in 2001 to abolish the tolerance zone in Edinburgh after 18 years, with campaigners continuing to call for it to be reinstated before more lives were lost. In the same Scotsman article in 2006, it was reported that, despite the abolishment of the tolerance zone in Edinburgh, sex workers in Glasgow were still at a much higher risk of meeting a violent death and were more likely to be attacked than sex workers in Edinburgh. And according to Wikipedia in 2012, the council in Edinburgh came under pressure not to renew the licences to massage parlours and saunas, and so subsequently many saunas were forced to close down. In 2002, a member of the Scottish Parliament, Margot MacDonald, introduced the Prostitution Tolerance Zones Bill to the Scottish Parliament, which was calling for tolerance zones to be accepted and set up in Glasgow, Edinburgh and Aberdeen, which was supported by Edinburgh and Aberdeen police and councils, however not by Glasgow police or councils. And sadly, this bill was withdrawn in 2005. Along with the police not being cast in a great light around their attitude towards sex workers and their handling of the sex workers' murders, they were also under ongoing pressure due to the continual murmurings about the similarities in some of the murders and whether there was in fact a serial killer walking the streets of Glasgow, with an article in the Herald newspaper stating that given the number of unsolved murders and the striking similarities between the murders of Karen McGregor, Leona McGovern, Jacqueline Gallagher and Emma Caldwell, such as their occupations, methods of murder and geography, reviews should be carried out. As well as Scots criminologist Professor David Wilson stating in an article in 2006, following 5 sex workers either going missing or being murdered in December 2006 in the southeast of England, that there were striking similarities between them and the murders of Diane McAnally and Karen McGregor, and that no one emerges as a multiple killer in one weekend. There is almost certainly a history there. It was also confirmed in the same article that the English police officers hunting the murderer of these 5 sex workers in South East England were in talks with Strathclyde Police in Glasgow to see if there were indeed any links that could be established between them and the sex workers in Glasgow, going on to say that the Glasgow murders are too similar to be ignored. Needless to say, the pressure continued not only for the police to bring those responsible for the sex worker murders to justice, but also on the Glasgow Police and Glasgow councils to find a way to work with the sex workers of Glasgow to make their working environments as safe a place as possible, to try and ensure that there were no further sex worker murders. However, despite the ongoing pressure, the debates and opinions that raged on for many years after Emma Caldwell's murder in 2005, it would be a cold case review in 2013 and a man being arrested for an assault in 2018 that brought Tracy Wilde's case back into the spotlight, while at the same time destroying another man's life. Join me next time for the final part of our serial victims episodes, where we will find out if anyone was brought to justice for Tracy Wilde's murder, and we'll tell you if there were any other potential suspects along the way who could have murdered any of the victims, who, as yet, had not received justice. But before I go, I'd like to tell you about an upcoming episode I plan to do regarding 14-year-old Luke Mitchell being found guilty of murdering 14-year-old Jodie Jones in Dalkeith in 2003. You may have heard of this case before, as there has been a lot of media attention and documentaries over the years. However, I came across a fantastic new podcast earlier this year called Real, hosted by award-winning TV producer Naomi Channel, where, over 7 episodes, Naomi does a deep dive into Jodie's murder and Luke's conviction, which includes interviews with experts, with Luke's biggest supporter, Dr. Sandra Lean, and with Luke himself. I feel Naomi has done an absolutely amazing job putting forward the facts of this case, while trying not to give her own opinions. And so instead of trying to redo what Naomi has already done, instead I contacted Naomi to ask if she would like to do an episode with me. An episode where we could talk about her episodes and some of the extraordinary things she uncovered throughout her thorough research, where Naomi could give her opinions and elaborate on areas that needed more discussion, as well as answer any questions I had after listening to her episodes. And Naomi gladly agreed. However, Naomi and I would also love to hear from our listeners. So, if you haven't already, I would love for you to have a listen to Naomi's podcast, Real, specifically her Through the Wall episodes around the murder of Jodie Jones and the conviction of Luke Mitchell. Naomi and I would love to hear your opinions and thoughts around what Naomi's research has uncovered. And if you have any questions at all around this topic that you would like me to put to Naomi, you can contact me on social media or email me at contact@scottishmurders.com. The link to Naomi's podcast, Real, will be in the show notes. We look forward to hearing from you.
Scottish Murders is a production of Clurin Ton.